Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Xinjiang Crisis Conference. We're going to be sticking to timekeeping today. We were quite a little bit lax yesterday at moments, so today we're going to be ruling with an iron fist, I'm afraid, hence the chivying. So yeah, I'm very pleased to introduce our first panel, panel 6, which is entitled NGO Reports, Crimes Against Humanity in Xinjiang. And I'm delighted to welcome our chair, Professor Penny Green from Queen Mary University, London. Welcome, Penny.
Okay, I think we're going to begin very on time, or almost on time, and I'm going to approach this in the Dirk Moses way of maintaining order. So let's begin. I want to introduce our first speaker, Maya Wang. Everybody is online, it's, apart from me. I'm sorry about that. Oh, the first speaker, can I have that please, because this is not the correct one. Thank you very much. Our first speaker is Sophie Richardson from Human Rights Watch, and she's going to talk about Break Their Lineage, Break Their Roots, China's crimes against humanity, targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Sophie, over to you. Thank you very much. You have 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to help support the conference. And hats off to Professor Smith-Finley for organizing such an incredible gathering. Joe, you've been, I think, one of the most courageous activists, academics in bringing this issue to the fore in a lot of different communities. It's 4 in the morning here in Washington, and I have new glasses, so I'm going to have to take them off to be able to look at my notes. So my apologies. But I wanted to just say a few words about the report that we published in May of this year, and I apologize that I'm a poor substitute for my colleague Maya Wang. But in May of this year, HRW and our very good friends at the Stanford Law School's Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Department published the report. and arbitrary detention. And then in June 2021, 44 governments did the same, again, across regional group, and Turkey published a comparable statement. I think in some ways this sounds like slow and perhaps not the most meaningful progress, but it's, we think, one of the most important ways of getting to the idea of actually holding Chinese government officials accountable. Our view is that no state is above the law, no matter how powerful it is, and that kind of accountability has been pursued. There are other steps that some states have taken and should pursue, including new targeted sanctions and visa bans against responsible officials. One of the tougher ideas, but one we think has merit, is about pursuing individual criminal and state responsibility for these crimes through universal jurisdiction cases, meaning that people can actually be prosecuted in other states for the crimes committed inside China. We can talk about that more if people would like. Obviously, we encourage all governments not to forcibly return anyone to China. And I think I just reminded the State Department a day or two ago that they need to be smarter with their partners in alerting embassies and consulates worldwide that Uyghurs and Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs, hold PRC passports, but that they need special consideration. That they can't just be put on a plane back to the mainland, and that they need to do a better job of supporting and protecting diaspora communities. There's also a lot of work still to do around the involvement of both Chinese and foreign companies that may be involved in forced labor or simply in their inability to perform adequate human rights due diligence. Many of us are members of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, which has advanced some very important work on forced labor issues. I want to make sure I'm keeping to time here, but two final points. One is that Human Rights Watch has spent 20 years trying to document violations in Xinjiang, and not only do we want to thank all of the people who've had the confidence in us to share their stories, but also the kind of cooperation and collaboration that we've had, with people on the panel and their organizations, with people in the room and their organizations, and a lot of people we know we can't name. We couldn't do our work without that kind of cooperation, and we're incredibly grateful for it. But we also think that this is an incredibly important moment to hold a P5 member state accountable and show that Chinese government officials cannot expect impunity anymore. And I think that's an important idea to plant with governments and to actually pursue in the here and now. We believe that Uyghurs and others deserve no less after decades of agony and serious human rights crimes. So I'll stop there. I hope there'll be lots of questions, but I hand off to my wonderful fellow panelists. Thanks.
Many thanks, Sophie. You've actually finished early, which gives us a little bit more time for questions and contributions at the end, so that's terrific. Now, continuing our theme about crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, we're going now to move to, we've had Human Rights Watch, now we move to Amnesty International, and Jonathan LOEB. Jonathan's going to be speaking about a report that they have also been involved in. Jonathan, are you ready?
And thank you, Sophie and Aina. It's great to be speaking with both of you. So I'm going to talk about Amnesty International's recent report, Like We Were Enemies in a War, China's Mass Internment, Torture, and Persecution of Muslims in Xinjiang. It's a very long report. It's nearly 200 pages, so I'm just going to do a summary for all of you in the next 10 minutes, but I'm happy to answer questions on any aspect of it. The report was the product of field and remote research that was carried out between October 2019 and June 2021, so over the course of 20 months. And our report's findings and conclusions are based off firsthand testimonies that Amnesty gathered from former detainees of the internment camps, as well as other people who were present in Xinjiang during the past 4 years, as well as from an analysis of satellite imagery and data. Just a little bit of context, 108 people were interviewed for the report, 55 former detainees, 15 other witnesses, as well as numerous family members of people who are still missing or detained in Xinjiang. The majority of the interviewees were Kazakh, a minority were Uyghur, and a small minority were Kyrgyz or Han Chinese. To put it in a little context, the sort of 55 former detainees represent a significant portion of all public testimonial evidence gathered about the situation inside the internment camps. As I'm sure many of you listening today know, despite the fact that these crimes have affected millions of people in Xinjiang, with Amnesty's research, with the research of Human Rights Watch and ILI and others, in aggregate and total, still fewer than 100 survivors of these camps have ever been interviewed. And that fact is based primarily on the obstacles to investigating the situation in Xinjiang that come from the government. So we face these, and I'm confident that the other panelists have also faced these obstacles. And essentially, the government has devoted and continues to devote tremendous resources to preventing the international community, NGOs, human rights groups, journalists from investigating the situation in Xinjiang. It prevents millions of people from communicating about the situation, denies journalists and investigators meaningful access, stages tours for those who are able to enter, and forcibly enlists members of the population to parrot its falsehoods. And even more severely, anyone living in Xinjiang who speaks out about the internment camps is perceived to have spoken out or is affiliated with anyone who has spoken out, risks detention, arrest, imprisonment, and torture and disappearance, not only for themselves, but for their family members. As a result of this, all the interviews that we did in our report were conducted anonymously over secure channels, and we removed not only the names, but all other information that could be used to identify anyone who we spoke with. Notwithstanding these obstacles and others, we were able to collect a significant amount of information. So I'll give you a summary of that now. But the evidence that Amnesty gathered provided the factual basis for the conclusion that the government has committed at least 3 crimes against humanity: imprisonment, torture, and persecution. It also provides the factual basis that the government has severely violated numerous elements of international human rights law, including the right to liberty and security, to privacy, freedom of movement, to opinion and expression, to religion and belief, and to participation in cultural life, and to equality and non-discrimination. And 2 things to mention about these broad conclusions. According to our research, these violations are carried out in such a widespread and systematic manner that they are now an inexorable aspect of daily life for millions of members of predominantly Muslim ethnic groups living in Xinjiang. Another thing to point out is that the conclusions, in a certain sense, are conservative, and they are based off Amnesty evidence alone. And so we wanted to do something that augmented the already significant body of evidence that was put out there by groups like ILI and HRW and journalists. And so these conclusions, including our legal conclusions, are based off Amnesty's evidence alone. However, when we do get to our recommendations at the end, we are, like others, recommending a full investigation into not only the crimes documented by Amnesty, but the other crimes that have been credibly documented by others. And so just very quickly, there's about 120 pages on the different abuses. They are divided broadly into 2 categories: those that have occurred outside the internment camps and those inside the camps. In terms of outside the camps, we go through all the different human rights violations that I mentioned. We focus quite intensely on 2, on surveillance and on freedom of religion. According to our research and others, Muslims living in Xinjiang are likely the most closely surveilled population in the world. The government has devoted tremendous resources to gathering incredibly detailed information about these groups' lives, and this systematized mass surveillance is achieved through a combination of policies and practices that infringe upon people's right to privacy and freedom of movement and expression. And we detail all the different things that are involved in this system of mass surveillance, from the biometric data collection to the invasive interviews by government officials, to the regular searches by ubiquitous security officers, homestays by government employees and cadres, ever-present network of surveillance cameras and convenience police stations, as well as unfettered access to people's personal communication devices. And two things just to point out about the surveillance is, according to our research and others, it is carried out in an extraordinarily discriminatory manner that is directed primarily at predominantly Muslim ethnic groups in Xinjiang. Also, it is the surveillance, I believe, that enables a lot of the rest of the abuses to take place. So knowing where everyone is and what they are saying at all times enables the government to then further target individuals and their families in a variety of different ways. The second abuse occurring outside the camps that we really focus on was freedom of religion, which has been documented widely by others, but I don't think it can be emphasized enough the extent to which the region is hostile to the practice of Islam. None of the people that we spoke with who had lived in the region or who had been to a camp felt comfortable displaying any sign of religious practice, and all believed that doing so would result in them being detained and sent to the camp. According to those witnesses, numerous Islamic practice that Muslims widely consider to be essential to their religion have been explicitly prohibited by law, and others that were not explicitly prohibited by law are now in effect prohibited. This includes praying, attending mosques, teaching religion, giving your children Islamic sounding names. And as a result of the constant credible threat of detention, Muslims in Xinjiang have dramatically modified their behavior in such a way that they no longer display outward signs of religious practice. And among the people who we interviewed for this report included former government officials, several of whom gave accounts of being sent into the houses of Muslim families and being told to take Qurans off the walls, to take pictures of mosques off the walls, and to instruct people that it was no longer appropriate to have these or to behave in many, many different ways and to do many different things related to religion. So that's just a little bit on two of the many human rights abuses that we document. The majority of the report is devoted to what happens inside the camps. Again, a little bit of context. All 55 of the people who we interviewed who had been sent to a camp had been detained arbitrarily for what appears to be, by all reasonable standards, entirely lawful conduct. That is, without committing any internationally recognized criminal offense. We believe that this is the case for nearly all, likely all people who have been sent to internment camps. And we again interviewed several government officials who were involved in mass arrests of Muslims in Xinjiang. And according to their accounts, I mean, people were arrested for essentially just being Muslim. That said, when people were given explicit reasons for their arrest, according to our research, these fell into three broad categories. The first related to anything involving going abroad, whether that's living, studying abroad, calling family members abroad, was grounds for being arrested and sent to a camp. The second is having any unauthorized software on your phone or laptop or communication device. So having WhatsApp or Skype or anything secure, anything that is not authorized by the government that they cannot directly monitor. And again, this goes to the surveillance, is grounds for being sent to a camp. And the third category that we documented were any activities related to religion. So praying, attending a mosque, this would get you sent to a camp. Again, our sample is biased in different ways, primarily that we are speaking only to people who were able to get out of camps and to get to a place where they felt relatively safe to speak with an NGO, even if they were doing so anonymously. And this actually goes to a broader point that I would like to bring up that's been reported elsewhere in the press, but we found throughout our research, and that is that all detainees who go to internment camps are divided when they arrive into three categories that are loosely translated as normal, strict, and very strict. And 53 of the 55 people who we interviewed were in the normal category for the entirety of their time in detention. and the other 2 were temporarily in the strict category and then transferred to a normal category. And I believe that nearly all of the other former detainees who've been interviewed by journalists and other organizations were also in the least strict or normal category. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is, as terrible as the abuses documented in this report are and in other human rights reports, they are likely only a description of life for people who are in the least strict category. And from what we do know, from the little testimony we have and from the significant sort of secondhand testimony, people in the strict and more strict categories are treated significantly worse than those in the normal category. So tragically, all the abuses we describe here perhaps are not as bad as it gets for a significant portion of the population. So very quickly, just to go through some of the abuses that we documented, all detainees are subject to a ceaseless indoctrination campaign, physical and psychological torture and other forms of ill treatment. From the moment they enter a camp, a detainee's lives are extraordinarily regimented. They're stripped of their personal autonomy. Every aspect of their life is dictated to them. And detainees who deviate from the prescribed conduct are reprimanded and often physically punished. Was I lost for a second there? Everyone cut out, or can you hear me? Nope, sorry. Okay. We go into detail about the daily routine of people in the camps. Often people are forced to sit still in terribly uncomfortable positions for hours on end. There's no privacy, there's insufficient food, water, exercise, health care. There's unsanitary and unhygienic conditions, very limited fresh air and exposure to natural light. Everyone living in the camps is forced to, the lights are always on in your cell, and for 2 hours each night you have to monitor other detainees to ensure that they are not covering their heads with a blanket or ensure they're not committing suicide. Significant portion of the report is devoted to the so-called education that occurs in the camp. Hours and hours each day, people are subjected to this so-called education, which is divided broadly into language training and political education. Detainees are forbidden expressly from speaking in their native tongues, whether that's Kazakh or Uyghur or another language. Doing so, again, gets you physically punished. And the political education largely focuses on forcibly indoctrinating detainees about the evils of Islam and about how prosperous, powerful, and benevolent Chinese Communist Party and President Xi Jinping are. One thing that I just focus on a bit is there is a lot in our report on torture. This formed the basis of our conclusion that the crime against humanity of torture had occurred. According to our research, every former camp detainee was tortured or subjected to other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. And we would go as far to say as the government claims these camps are set up to educate. You can make a case that these camps are set up to torture. Torture and other ill treatment are constitutive elements of life in the internment camps. Quickly, we divide the torture into 2 broad categories. The first category includes the physical and non-physical, that is mental or psychological torture and other ill treatment that is experienced by all detainees as a result of the cumulative effect of daily life in the camps. The combination of these physical and non-physical measures in conjunction with the total loss of personal autonomy in the camps is likely to cause and has caused mental and physical suffering severe enough to constitute torture. The second category of torture and other ill treatment occurred during interrogations and as punishments for misbehavior by specific detainees. And we documented this category of torture occurring in roughly 1/3 of the former detainees who we interviewed. The torture methods included beatings, electric shocks, stress positions, the unlawful use of restraints, including being locked in metal tiger chairs where your arms and legs are affixed to a chair. And in many cases, people were forced to sit in these chairs without food or water for periods of 24 hours or more. People were subjected to sleep deprivation, being hung from walls, being subjected to extremely cold temperatures, as well as solitary confinement. And so that evidence that we gathered about torture forms the basis for our conclusion that the crime against humanity of torture has occurred. We also have a big section on life after the camps. We go into some detail trying to determine why certain detainees are released and others are not. To be frank, that process is not well understood even by the individuals themselves as to why certain people are released and others are not. We also talk a bit about
Can you start winding up now, please, Jonathan?
Situations where people have been transferred from a camp to a situation that we believe violates the International Labor Organization's definition of forced labor. That included 4 detainees who were sent to factories, and I think 7 or 8 who were forced to do labor in a variety of
Jonathan, I'm sorry, you're over time now, so could you wind up immediately, please? Sorry. You haven't been able to hear the messaging, I think.
Last point, was just we have a huge campaign going on focusing on the thousands of people who are still remained in detention. And that's it. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move on to our third speaker on the panel on crimes against humanity, Aina SHORMANBAYEVA from the International Legal Initiative. Over to you, Aina.
I'm a human rights defender, and we see these problems and this crisis in Xinjiang from the human rights perspective as our colleagues from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And we are practitioners who are working directly with the victims, and we also collecting testimonies. And ILI has at the moment 50 testimonies from mainly ethnic Kazakh victims in Kazakhstan, living in Kazakhstan. So, and according to their testimonies, the repressions against ethnic Kazakhs started in 2017. And this year, the ethnic Kazakh repatriates from China concerned on their relatives in Xinjiang are reproduced in the camp or stripped from. What's the problem?
I think you're back.
Conducted 2 press conferences in Kazakhstan, and the whole people of Kazakhstan knew from these press conferences about the problems and about the repressions, mass repressions and mass violations of human rights in Xinjiang. From the testimonies of the victims we know currently, and I can say that this information is the same that in the reports of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, because the policy of Chinese authorities towards the ethnic minorities is the same. The criminal, I think, criminal actions against representative of ethnic minorities are the same. So, and I can mention not only arbitrary detentions, but also according to the testimonies, the facts of ethnic discrimination in employment, for example, in financial field, some of the victims claimed that ethnic Kazakhs cannot be appointed as senior accountants, for example, financial directors. Only they can only work as a cashier, for example. And a similar situation is with the teachers of former Kazakh schools. Their situation is harder because, according to the testimonies, about 1,900 Kazakh schools closed or transformed from Kazakh to Chinese schools. And the I'm sorry. What's the problem? And the teachers of Kazakh schools, they lost their job as teachers, as specialists, and they became the watchmen, for example, cleaning lady. And some of them, despite their health conditions, forced the hard work. It's a serious violation, and according to the testimonials of one family member living in Kazakhstan, his wife was a Kazakh teacher, and they cannot unite for more than 3 years because authorities in Xinjiang prohibited her to move to Kazakhstan and unite with her family despite her hard health conditions. She's very ill and cannot work, nor as a teacher, nor as a cleaning lady. But she was forced to watch the streets. So how as a guard, she's a woman, and she's working sometimes as a guard. It's strange to use teachers as a guard or watchman or cleaning lady. So a lot of claims were about forced collection of biological samples and health data. Some victims witnessed that in June 2016, the Xinjiang police ordered all residents applying for travel documents to provide DNA samples and other biological data. And some victims even witnessed about the virgin test of young girls in the schools. And this information is included in their records. And used when they, for example, go further to universities or institutes. So for the higher education. One of the prisoner, former prisoner, claimed that he was the forcibly blood donor, and the authorities of the camp, they took too much, and now he's very ill. We provided him medical assistance, but he lost ability to work and suffering financially as a result. So there are a lot of testimonies about the restrictions of freedom of religion, and I joined the information from my colleagues, and can add that for ethnic Kazakhs, they claimed that inspectors, there are the special inspectors who check whether there are or not the religious staffs in the homes of ethnic Kazakhs, or staffs with Kazakh national ornament, for example. And this permits other such bird this stuff. Testimony of Bolizira Awilhan mentioned yesterday. In Turkey, she was forced to help to collect the mountain. She said it was the mountain of Qurans. Camp, and the guards buried these Qurans. So other claims related to the violations of cultural rights. One of the victims, she was translator, and she helped to translate, transcript the books written by Kazakhstani authors from Kazakh Cyrillic to Kazakh Arabic. So, and she was arbitrarily detained for only for this, and all her library consisted of 1,000 books was confiscated by the police, the local police. Kazakh families, according to the testimonies, are prohibited from decorating their houses with Kazakh national ornaments, they cannot now to welcome each other. Assalam in Kazakh, or just to give their children Arabic or Muslim names such as Muhammad. So, and centuries old localities and settlements, their names changing in Chinese names. And it starts in 1970s. It's a very long policy to eliminate the traditional names of geographical localities and settlements from Uyghurs into Chinese. For example, Shaoxek, now called Tachen, Yin, Urumqi, Usu, and so on. Tanshan, Bogda, Kazakh. So, and a lot of names of the settlements changed. Violations of freedom of movement was especially hard for ethnic Kazakhs because it led to the separation of the families. Local authorities confiscated the passports since 2017. And many Kazakhs they cannot visit without the permission of the authorities Kazakhstan, because they need to take back their passport and get the visa in Kazakh embassy. So Kazakh, I need to know that Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs, their perception of the land in Xinjiang, where regions where they are living, mostly Altai, Tarbagatai, and Ili, and Kazakhstan is the one homeland for them. So, and Kazakhstan or Xinjiang is the homeland for ethnic Kazakhs. And families, in many cases, decided to move to Kazakhstan, not as a whole family, but a part of family. Some family members moved to Kazakhstan, benefited the state program of repatriation, got the citizenship of Kazakhstan, and they are now living in Kazakhstan as Kazakhstani citizens. But their relatives in Xinjiang, the family members, they remained in Xinjiang. They got the permanent residence permits from Kazakhstan for many reasons, for business, for example, and so on. And they visited Kazakhstan very often. And later, these visits were the main reason for their arbitrary detention to the camps. So, and violations of freedom of movement also are not only the confiscating the passports, but the freedom of movement restricted inside the Xinjiang. Every 100, 200 meters, there are the checkpoints and police checkpoints, and they cannot walking free on the streets because there are checks by police every 100 or 200 meters, and even I'm sorry, ethnic Kazakhs are constantly monitored in public places, and even according to the testimonies, their homes, because there are the cameras inside their homes. They cannot even speak openly at the home, and they switch off such accessories or so. And according to the victims' witnesses, the freedom of speech and expression is totally violated in Xinjiang. For example, not only towards the ethnic Kazakhs or Uyghurs. For example, one of the victims witnessed that one Hui woman in the camp was arbitrarily detained for critics of local authorities for the corruption. So, and that's not the full information that I can express here, but we are continuing our work with the victims. We are providing them medical assistance, legal assistance, psychological assistance with the help of international organizations such Amnesty International, private companies such Badger Sportswear, other embassies, other organizations, our colleagues in Kazakhstan. So it's a huge work and risky in many cases, but we're dedicated to this work to protect the dignity, because the main thing is eliminating the dignity of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tatar, and other Turkic Muslim people of Xinjiang, which are especially Uyghurs and Kazakhs, are indigenous people.
Could you start to wind up now, please?
Thank you so
Aina?
much.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much for keeping to time. Thank you very much, panelists. We can now open up for questions and contributions. It's now about 10 to 10, and we have until, I think, 10:15. So we have a reasonable amount of time now. So can I take 2 or 3 questions to begin with, please? Any questions about crimes against humanity in relation to the human rights organizations? Hannah? Anybody else? I'll take Hannah. We've got one.
Yes.
Oh, we have a YouTube question. I'm sorry. So would you like, first of all, could you read the online question or give it to me so I can read it out?
Yeah. Give it.
The question.
Ask the question. Okay, so we have one question about the repeated nature of detainment, and are there any statistics as to how often people are summoned back to the camp after initial release?
So did you all catch that, that question, panelists? Please repeat it. Oh yeah, well it would help me. You want some statistics on the return of people to the camps once they've been released? Was that the primary question? So do you have information on those who've been in the camps but have been released and what happens to them afterwards? Is there a process of re-encampment, for example? People are shaking their heads in answer to that question. Anybody want to contribute from the panel to add to that? Meanwhile, is there anybody in the audience who has an answer to the question? Has anybody been doing work empirical work on those who have been in the camps, released, and then reinterred? Does anybody have any information in response to that question?
Okay, to the question, is there any data on people who have been interned released and then re-interned. We do not have any data like that. We did do some work about people who had been imprisoned, showing that the rates of imprisonment in the region have gone up significantly, but we don't have information about people who were in political re-education camps, then released, then re-interned in political education camps. But perhaps Aina or Jonathan can provide some information.
Sure. I think of the 55 people we interviewed, 2 or 3 were sent to a camp, released, and then sent to a camp again, and then released. But I would be hesitant to draw any sort of larger trend or stats from that. But I do know that it happens.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me now?
Yes, there are such data on the people who have been interned, released, and re-interned. We have testimony of 2 or 3 also victims who were initially arbitrarily detained for a short time period, but then later for a longer period. There are such data.
Thank you. We now have a second question, Hannah's question, which we will also type into the chat. Please. Hannah? You had your hand up earlier. Yes.
So the 3 people there, they're all from human rights organizations. So I'm wondering, since they all concluded that this is crimes against humanity, is that a coincidence that it's human rights organizations who have been working on this topic in different areas, that they all conclude it's crimes against humanity, whereas other like scholars or think tanks come to the conclusion that we're seeing genocide. So I would like to know how come that human rights organizations are concluding this.
Very good question. Can you hear me, panelists? No. So this will be typed into the chat. And just very briefly, is somebody doing that now? Thank you. It is an interesting question. And I think it speaks to the nature of human rights organizations as much as it speaks to academia.
Sorry. Jonathan, do you want to go ahead? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies. I can start. I mean, in terms of Amnesty's conclusion of crimes against humanity, I would just emphasize again that our conclusions are based off the testimony that we gathered primarily ourselves, as well as some of the other information that was out there, but we wanted to base something off what we had gathered. And according to that testimonial evidence, the legal case that we could make was for crimes against humanity. We simply do not have the evidence for all of the elements of the crime of genocide under international law. It was that simple in our case. We just followed the facts, put them together, and we could conclude these 3 crimes against humanity. Specifically, we didn't have the evidence for additional crimes.
I'm happy to add to that, unless I know you want to go ahead.
I agree. In a broader sense, it's a crime against humanity. But there are evidences of genocide because the policy is directed to cut the to decrease the ethnic minorities and to revert them into standard Chinese, so the standard citizen of China, without any national, cultural, ethnic identity. So I think it's a crime against humanity, but if it will be useful to bring to justice. Lawyers can use these facts as evidence of crimes, of genocide crimes.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Like Jonathan, our conclusion is largely based on our own evidence. I think there's a perception that's not entirely accurate that crimes against humanity are somehow significantly less bad than genocide, which is really not the case. And I think it's important not just to read the Genocide Convention and think about the actions that, on paper are supposed to flow from it by governments, but often don't. Relative to successful prosecutions of genocide, I think it's something like 8 or 9 people have been successfully prosecuted on that charge. And for all of the information that's being discussed these few days, actual prosecutions of genocide have an incredibly high threshold for proving state intent. And perhaps one of the discussions, I don't know if people can hear me, maybe that could flow from this, an exercise in looking at those prosecutions, and assessing whether we think there are viable legal avenues. There's also the challenge that, because China is not a party to the Rome Statute, that effectively shuts down some avenues, and that even prosecuting cases of crimes against humanity would perhaps require the establishment of some sort of freestanding body to actually hear the cases, which would be an incredible diplomatic lift, something akin to, for example, the extraordinary chambers for Cambodia or the tribunal for Rwanda. And crimes against humanity, not only, it's not just the case that we think that is what fits the currently available facts, but it does also open up the possibility of prosecutions under universal jurisdiction statutes, and especially for an audience that's sitting in the UK. I think maybe one of the best parallels to point to is the recent prosecutions in Germany of Syrians on allegations of torture. Those are not crimes that took place in Germany. Those are crimes that took place in Syria, but it is now possible to prosecute people in other countries for serious human rights crimes. And in that sense, making a case for crimes against humanity can still be a movable construct, or an actionable construct, maybe the better way to say it. So that hopefully that helps explain our perspective, because we think constantly, as I'm sure my fellow panelists and people in the room do as well, how to actually get someone like Chen Chuanguo in the dock, prosecuted, investigated, and prosecuted for serious human rights crimes. So hopefully that helps explain how, at least, Human Rights Watch's thinking.
Can I just add, the conclusions that we made, and I believe this holds for other organizations too, about crimes against humanity does not negate a finding of genocide by another organization. So we did not have an argument that came out against that in any way. And I would also add to that, that when we're calling for an investigation, it's not just into the crimes that we documented. There is sufficient reason that an international investigative mechanism should absolutely be empowered to investigate crimes against humanity, allegations of genocide, and other serious violations of international human rights law. And that's what we're pushing for, and that's what we support.
So questions?
Question is building on Hannah's paper on Uyghur linguicide. And the question is, what's happening to Kyrgyz schools and language schools in East Turkestan?
Could the panelists hear that question? So it's going to have to be typed in. You've typed it in? Okay. The question there is, what's happening in Kyrgyz school language in East Turkestan? Same story, question mark. Would the panelists like to respond, if they can? Sophie's not.
On this, we do not have much information. Perhaps Aina can, or Jonathan can speak to this.
Aina, please go ahead if you have anything.
I think it's the same story because this is a centralized policy of Chinese authorities. It's not only against Kazakh schools. A lot of Uyghur schools also transformed into Chinese schools. And yesterday, the colleagues already discussed this issue very detailed. It's related to all the schools with national languages. They all standardized and became the Chinese schools. So I think it's the same story for Kyrgyz schools. But I hear about Kyrgyz schools. We have only one testimony of ethnic Kyrgyz, but no words about the schools, and maybe we need to look deeply in this.
I'll just add that this is a topic we wrote about this year with respect to what is referred to as bilingual education in Tibetan areas, but really that now means that the only class in Tibetan that children in Tibetan areas have access to is a Tibetan language class, and that increasingly the rest of the curriculum is all taught in Chinese. We've all seen the same information about that issue driving protests for Mongolian speakers. We've seen the imposition of Chinese Mandarin rather than Cantonese drive protests in Hong Kong, and I agree with Aina's perspective that this is a national level policy and part of the campaign to quote unquote sinicize people and make them speak the national language. I use that term euphemistically, and it's a very clear violation of a couple of the different conventions to which the Chinese government is a state party, and it's actually an issue on which the Chinese government has been criticized since I think 1996 by the SESCR and the Commission on the Rights of the Child.
From the panelists on that question, is there another virtual question? Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, I think we'll draw this session to a close. It's been a little bit of a struggle, I think, technically. But I think what we might do is please could you write a thank you to the panelists and apologies for not being able to hear them for the last part of the session, but to thank them very much for their patience and endurance. And I think in that sense, let's clap the panelists one more time. And I think we now move on to a coffee break, which I think you're...
Can we please restart again prompt at 10:30, but you've got an extended coffee break now of 22 minutes, so enjoy.